Hi everyone, this is Sharik Zafar. I'm the Special Representative to Muslim Communities at the Department of State, and I'm here at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. And I'm here with Dr. Asma Naeem, who's a curator here. Dr. Naeem, tell us a little bit about your work here at the Smithsonian.
Well, you can call me Asma first of all.
Okay, Asma.
And so nice to be here with you, Sharik, and hello to all of our friends all over the world. I'm here to talk about the National Portrait Gallery and also this portrait of Yara Mahmood. The National Portrait Gallery, Sharik, is a really fascinating place for our national history. We were founded in 1962 by Congress, and we are considered to be a museum that tells America's story through portraits. And specifically, we were mandated by Congress to tell the story of individuals who have made a significant impact on American history and culture, and we collect the portraits of those people. So the Portrait Gallery is this interesting place of history, biography, and art. And when people start to think about the art part, that's where it gets very interesting for us at the National Portrait Gallery. Because portraits, images of people, portraiture, is actually a really sticky concept in some ways. When portraiture was first used, when you think of portraits of Roman emperors on coins, it was a vestige of power. It was a way to discuss and promote who was the leader at the time. And through the centuries, even from the time of ancient Rome, through the centuries that has pretty much stuck. So portraits were really an instrument of power. They were an instrument of wealth. The people who could commission portraits of themselves were the people who were wealthy, who were landowners, who were aristocrats. So we think of, portraits of Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, and you think of presidential portraits. So portraits have this baggage of being a medium for the elite. Now here at the National Portrait Gallery, we want to obviously tell many different stories, and we don't just want to tell the stories of those who were in power. We do have many presidential portraits. That's one of the reasons many people come to see us, and that's upstairs, which I hope you've seen at some point.
It's a terrific gallery, and for those of you who've ever been to Washington or who are coming to Washington, I highly recommend that gallery. It's absolutely terrific.
Yes, and we will be adding the portrait of President Obama at some point down the road after he leaves office. So please do come. But so in addition to presidential portraits, we wanted to tell more complicated stories than those that we usually find in our textbooks. So the way that we can usually do that is by bringing in photographs or prints, works on paper, where somebody's made a drawing of somebody or somebody's made a print of somebody. Because those mediums, photography and works on paper, are not as expensive as an oil on canvas like we have here.
So tell us a little bit about this painting. Because
Sure.
I think, given my role as Special Representative of the Muslim communities, it was very special for me to become aware of this.
Oh, well, thank you. So the place that it's in is actually an important part of the story of Yara Mahmood that we see here.
You said Yara Mahmood.
Yara Mahmood,
okay.
Yes. And this is the American Origins Galleries. These galleries that we're standing in, Sharik, are specifically constructed to tell the story of America in the first few decades. So we're in the gallery that's devoted to the first few decades of the 1800s. So outside of this gallery, we have a portrait of Alexander Hamilton. Just down the hall, we have a portrait of Benjamin Franklin that is used for the dollar bill. So there's a lot of important stories that we get from our textbooks, but we wanted to complicate how people view the early 1800s because there seems to be, we wanted to have some surprises, let me say it that way. And one of the surprising things that we tell people is that Muslims have been in this country from the very beginning. And finding a portrait of a Muslim to tell that story was a challenge for us because of the reasons that I've stated. But Muslims have been in this country from the very beginning. Actually, when Christopher Columbus came, on his ship were people who had been forcibly converted to Christianity who were Muslim. So even in the late 15th century, we had Muslims coming over to this country. And then, of course, the biggest influx of Muslims was through the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, something I think a relatively large percentage of slaves were brought over were actually Muslim.
Exactly, and there's really no hard number that we can fix to that because it's very hard to put a number on exactly who was converted and who did practice and who didn't practice. because many slaves, when they came to the U.S., believe it or not, they were they couldn't exercise their right to practice their religion, and they were made fun of and they were embarrassed. But this individual was somebody who was able to practice his religion freely and who became widely known for practicing his religion.
So Yarrow was a slave.
Yeah.
Brought over from West Africa, Guinea.
Yes, yeah, from the Senegambia area of West Africa. He was a Fulani.
Mm-hmm.
He was from the Fuda Jalon tribe. He was born around 1736, and he was taken onto a slave ship, the slave ship Elijah, and brought over to Annapolis, which is not too far from here, in 1752. And he was sold at auction there. He was about 16 years old, and he was sold to a family that had a plantation nearby, the Beale family, and he eventually made his way to Georgetown, where he worked for the Sun. He was always kind of Yarrow was always a slight man. He wasn't that strong, he wasn't that tall, so he was kind of given the tasks of a butler, so to speak. And eventually he was granted manumission, he was given freedom, and that was in the late 1790s. Now at this point he had been working in Georgetown for several decades, and what he decided to do was he was going to live the American dream.
Sure.
And so he started to save up money. He worked very hard. He worked in the morning and in the night, and he became a brick maker, a basket maker. He made charcoal, and he saved up enough money to eventually buy a house. And we know that because we have a record of the deed of the house he bought in Georgetown, where he signed his name in Arabic. Now, the story gets very interesting because why did this man, who seems to be, a common man in many ways, granted, he tells the American dream in such an interesting way. He went from the slave ship to owning a house in Georgetown, which is, for our friends all over the world, it's a very exclusive area now. The interesting thing about him is that there was another immigrant, and this is the part that I love, is that this story of Yarrow tells the story of so many other immigrants that were involved and that made this country so vibrant in the early decades of the 1800s. So an Irishman named David Warden, who came over here and eventually became a member of the State Department, so to speak, at the time, he was a diplomat, decided to draw out descriptions of the District of Columbia, the nation's first capital, by getting specific vignettes of people who live there.
Right.
So he wrote a book, and he put in a vignette of Yarrow, where a resident of Georgetown describes Yarrow as this really hardworking man who saved up enough money, $100, which was a lot of money at the time, but then gave it to a man whom he trusted with the money, and that man went bankrupt. So he lost that money. So then Yarrow worked hard again, and he saved up more money, and $100 again. He gave it to a second man. That second man went bankrupt and died. But Yarrow did not give up, and I think that's why the story was included in this book that was published in 1816 and in Paris. For the third time, Yarrow saved up more money, kept making baskets, kept making bricks, kept making charcoal, and he eventually earned $200 that he then put into a bank. Somebody said, we do have banks in this country, and this would be a good place for you to put your money. So he put his money in the bank, and with that money he was able to become a prosperous citizen. But in the description of Yarrow in that book, I think he became kind of an international celebrity, so to speak. He was described as being 80 years old at the time. Mm-hmm. So this is where it gets even more interesting, because Charles Willson Peale, I don't know if you know who Charles Willson Peale is.
He painted President Washington, right?
Yes, exactly. So he was one of our most famous portrait painters, and he painted George Washington numerous times. He was interested in ideas of longevity and how human beings could live longer. He somehow got wind of Yarrow's story. He decided that he was coming down to DC on stagecoach from Philadelphia and to make a portrait of President Monroe. And President Monroe is an interesting person. We can talk about that later, just in terms of how he was, his wonderful attitudes towards slaves. Charles Willson Peale was coming down to paint a portrait of James Monroe. He said, I'm going to stop and make a portrait of this guy. So he kept a detailed diary, and we have that to this day, of spending 2 days with Yarrow. And during those 2 days, he talked about Yarrow as this great, most Muslim, he called him a Mohammedan, which is what they called Muslims back then. He talks about how he steadfastly refused to eat pork, he didn't drink alcohol, he was heard singing praises to Allah in the street, and he was a strong swimmer. He swam in the Potomac almost every day, and he was known as this cheerful, pious man. And many people describe Yarrow as this very good-natured, hard-working man. So Charles Willson Peale made a portrait of Yarrow, and that's hanging in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Can I show you just a little image of it? So just a sidetrack before we get to this actual portrait. This is a brochure that we're going to have at the Portrait Gallery Sharp, and it's also going to be made available online for content. And it's called Yarrow Mammoth, the Muslim Presence in the Early Republic. But this is the Charles Willson Peale portrait that he painted in 1819 of Yarrow.
So he's older here.
He's older in this one.
Okay,
this is 3 years later. Yeah, and so Charles Willson Peale made this portrait from life.
Wow.
And he sat and he looked at Yarrow, he spoke with Yarrow, and he made the painting that now hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Before it went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, it was shown at Charles Willson Peale's museum that he had in Philadelphia. And so another immigrant in DC got an idea. And this was a Scottishman. He was from Scotland. He said, I've been working for Charles Willson Peale in Baltimore and Philadelphia. I'm going to make a similar kind of museum here in DC. And I want to get another portrait of Yarrow to hang in our museum. That was at 9th and Pennsylvania, not too far from here. It's called the Columbia Museum. So he asked a very young lad, his name was James Alexander Simpson. He was 19 years old when he painted this portrait of Yarrow. And once he completed the portrait, this portrait hung in that museum at 9th and Pennsylvania. We have a record of it from an 1820s newspaper saying, come and see the portrait of Yarrow at our museum.
Right.
So he became like a national celebrity, international celebrity, a local celebrity. That museum eventually died out. It didn't get enough funding. And this portrait ended up in the hands of the DC Public Library, the Georgetown branch, in the Peabody Room, where it's been hanging for decades.
And no one knew about it.
And well, I think people knew about it, but it wasn't getting enough attention as it deserved. And Jerry McCoy, the librarian there, has been fastidiously gathering all the historical documents related to Yarrow and Yarrow's story. There was a famous fire at the Georgetown Public Library. He ran out making sure that this painting didn't get hurt. And then, of course, we have the famous book about Yarrow, based on the author interacting with this portrait at the Georgetown Public Library.
This is James Johnston.
This is James Johnston. He wrote a book called From Slave Ship to Harvard, and it's available. You can buy it anywhere. And the thing that I love about this is that Yarrow was on a slave ship. His daughter-in-law, Polly, was the great-great-aunt of a man who went to Harvard University in the 1950s. So it's a wonderful story about the American dream.
So let me ask you this. We're at an institution in the Smithsonian, the National Portrait Gallery. In this room, we have portraits of we have presidents. Actually, a couple of we have presidents, other important leaders. What made you want to put this picture here? Why? What do you think it says? What message does it send about the diversity and history of America?
Well, it's exactly that, Char. I think the thing is, we want to be able to connect to people from all different backgrounds. We want to tell the story of America in more complicated ways. We want to say to our visitors that this is a country that prides itself on people of different backgrounds having accomplished something. Portraiture is very difficult because the people who got portrayed were usually not diverse.
Wealthy, rich. Well-educated.
Exactly. And so we are looking for ways to bring in portraits of people from different backgrounds. The important thing about this portrait of Yarrow Mammoth is that it adds another layer to our understanding of the horrible saga of slavery. It tells the unvarnished truth. This is a man who came over in shackles as a 16-year-old boy, was sold on the blocks in Annapolis, worked, for masters for much of his life, but was able at some point, through the kindness of one of his masters, to be free and then to earn enough money to have a home and to be widely respected and beloved in his town. And I think that the more people understand that Muslims have been here from the very beginning, that the man who painted George Washington painted this man, that's a pretty remarkable thing.
No, well, Asma, thank you so much. I think Yara's story it's a story of the African diaspora in the United States. It's a story of the tragedy of slavery.
Yes.
It's a story of Islam in America.
Yes.
But it's also a quintessential American story. And I think it's really been educational for me to learn a little bit more about Yara. But also, I have to say, I think we're also grateful that you and the leadership here at the Smithsonian, the National Gallery, made it a point to hang this picture, and to make sure that all Americans can learn about an American that we should all learn more about. And I think the Smithsonian just plays such an important role in our national life. You can come here, there's no cost to come here.
It's free.
It's free, like all Smithsonian institutions. Asma, Professor, Dr. David, thank you so much for telling us this terrific story about a man that I think deserves to be celebrated as an American.
Sharik, thank you for all the hard work you're doing for the State Department.
Thank you so much.